Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we talk internet taxation, legalized graft, and paid political broadcasting. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Trevor Burrus, research fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Constitutional Studies, who takes us on a tour of the campaign finance sausage factory and the meltdown of media credibility. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Jessica Melugin, adjunct fellow in technology policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Jessica, for 15 years, many states have been asking Congress for permission to collect sales tax from companies outside their states who sell over the internet. Some people see this as closing a loophole, while others call it taxation without representation. It seems to be a fight that's never going to go away, especially as big corporations change sides. Bring us up to date. What's the law of the land today?
The way it works today in most situations is there's only a sales tax assessed on a purchase on the internet if the seller has some sort of physical presence. They call it a nexus, so that could be a storefront or a warehouse in the state of the buyer. Other than that, there's a use tax that every buyer technically owes their state, but they're notoriously unpopular and difficult to enforce, and there's very little revenue collected from those.
And are consumers supposed to rat themselves out if they buy something over the internet and fork over sales tax to the locals, or not?
That is the general idea, and I'm sure we can all imagine how successful that is for the states. So in some sense, this whole debate is really a bit of a use tax enforcement problem. Now, many more people are buying things across borders because of the internet, and now the states are seeing that this is lost revenue, and it's so expensive and politically unpopular for them to go shake down their own residents for these taxes that they're looking to Congress for permission to reach across their state lines and have businesses out of state act as their tax calculators, collectors, and remitters.
Well, you know, I live in Massachusetts, and right across the border is New Hampshire, which has these state liquor stores, which are much cheaper than the liquor here because of the difference in taxes. Many Massachusetts residents go up there to buy their booze, and there was a time where they would send the Massachusetts State Police into the New Hampshire parking lots, write down license plates of Massachusetts citizens, and then stop them on the road and demand taxes.
Yes, I think that's an example of what the states are looking to avoid. That does not get you reelected if you're the person who's sent the cops out to write down license plates about who's buying booze. But to your point, internet sales are in some way sort of a democratization of people who live near borders' ability to exit their perhaps high tax regime and participate in a lower tax regime. And of course, it's that dynamic that we call healthy tax competition among states. And that's a very important part of federalism. And for people who oppose these new efforts, that's really what we're worried about getting lost in all of these new laws.
So if the laws change and it becomes a free-for-all for taxation, how many tax jurisdictions are there across the U.S. that would be clamoring for their pound of flesh?
Currently, and it's hard to get an exact number because there are 300 to 600 changes every year in sales taxes across the country. But there are about 10,000 distinct taxing jurisdictions. They bear very little resemblance to your zip code lines on a map, but they all have their own definitions, and what that means is that a candy bar in one district can be food, and therefore it wouldn't be taxed, but it could be sweets in another, and it would be taxed. So they each have their own definitions. They each have their own base, so a lot of local or state taxes will exempt locally made product, which is their right to do so, but what is taxable in one place is not taxable in the next. And then, of course, on top of that are tax holidays for back to school or whatever other occasion. And it's so different from place to place. And again, it's always changing.
So if I'm a vendor and I've got to worry about paying tax in 10,000 jurisdictions, I've got a lot of items, I've got to maintain a 10,000 by 10,000 matrix of tax rates that changes on a regular basis?
That's what this group would expect vendors to do. it's impossible to really know how much that would cost, but the studies do show that this would be incredibly expensive for mid-range businesses. And some of the legislation that's in front of Congress right now, there's some exemptions for very, very small businesses. But even when you get into mid-range, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars installing that software and integrating it into your website's programs. And then, again, because it's changing all the time, there's going to be close to $100,000, they estimate, of maintenance costs every year. So for a smaller firm, that could easily be the difference between a profit and not. These companies often operate with very, very narrow profit margins, and it's a huge burden to them.
So, Jessica, I can easily imagine an Amazon or Walmart using their massive IT and financial reporting systems to deal with all this. But will smaller companies basically be forced into their arms in order to stay in business?
Well, that is a part of the story that's perhaps most disturbing, is that these big box retailers that want extended powers for states to tax sales online already have a physical presence in all or the vast majority of the states. So they are already paying sales taxes in those places where their box stores are located. And they have chosen to place a store there. They have availed themselves of that obligation. And they also have capable and large accounting sections of their company to take care of that. But for an eBay seller who is selling his socks out of the garage online, that's certainly not the case. So it's in a bit of self-interest that these big box stores are looking to, they call it evening the playing field, which we can talk about is not necessarily accurate. But they really are looking to force these smaller competitors out of business. And then Amazon is an even more special case. They were opposing these new taxes for a long time, but as their business plan changed and they switched from a no sales tax advantage on many purchases to quick delivery, that necessitated them putting warehouses in more and more states. And right now, because that triggered sales tax obligations in those places, they're collecting sales tax in 28 states and on over 80% of their consumers. So they're now more aligned from a tax position with the big box retailers. And then on top of that, Amazon is hoping that these little guys who can't afford to comply with the tax laws will jump on board with them, sell off of their platform, and for a fee, of course, Amazon will go ahead and take care of their sales tax collection obligations. So it's very self-interested, which explains a lot, because thinking that Walmart, Target, Best Buy, and Amazon are worried about the mom-and-pop stores on Main Street being treated unfairly was never very believable.
So just like we've cartelized the banking industry and the healthcare industry, this looks like a great opportunity to cartelize retail.
Yes, there's a lot of people who would gain from this, none of which are taxpayers. So what is embodied in a couple forms of legislation right now is basically a state tax cartel. In 2000, a bunch of states got together and they decided, basically, I'll collect for you if you collect for me. And what they did was realize that the big hurdle they had, legally and realistically, is these 10,000 different jurisdictions. So they made great claims at the beginning that they were going to harmonize the sales tax rates across the country, make this very simple, very easy. 16 years later, there's 10,000 taxing jurisdictions, and there has not been any simplification. These guys at the local level who set their sales tax are not going to give up their little fiefdom and just go along with what the larger state wants. So it's a bit of a political impossibility that we'd really have any kind of big harmonization countrywide.
Internet taxes also sound like a great opportunity for lawyers, accountants, and software developers. Are they all out lobbying in favor of this too?
They are very willing to participate in the congressional hearings and talk about all the benefits of this. And yeah, they're the ones that stand to gain. This is more bureaucracy on top of more bureaucracy. And it sets a dangerous precedent in that way because the internet has been a largely bureaucracy-free place. And that's what so much of it thriving has to do with. Really, the government mostly has been hands-off to it, and this would change all of that.
Jessica, assuming the big corporate lobbyists eventually get their way and states start taxing internet sales, What's the difference between an origin-based and a destination-based tax plan?
Well, there's two major thrusts for how to deal with sales tax as we make more and more purchases over the internet. One of them is the destination-based approach, and that means that the tax is based on the buyer's location. So we're asking companies located completely outside of that buyer's state to collect and remit. So that is where we get our problems with 10,000 jurisdictions of compliance. That is a huge burden for companies. And we'd see immediately a certain number of companies that would be lethal for them, and they would be gone. Then we'd see a big shift onto bigger platforms like Amazon, where they'll pay to be helped with meeting this new tax obligation. The other idea is an origin approach, and that means that just like in the bricks and mortar world, we're going to tax at the point of purchase. So just as if you drive into a gas station and you pay what that gas station sales tax is right there. Nobody comes out, they don't check your driver's license, They don't check your plates, and then that person doesn't go inside and look up your home rate and charge you that and then send it to them. But that is essentially what a destination-based approach would be asking online retailers to do. And if it's crazy in the bricks and mortar world, it's no less crazy online. Where an origin-based, it works just like you would think it works in the real world. We're charging based on and remitting to that business's home domicile.
That sounds a whole lot simpler.
It is. It is a whole lot simpler. And one of its great benefits is one of its big political problems is that it encourages really healthy tax competition among the states.
You mean people would set up their businesses in low-tax states and ship to high-tax states?
Well, I think that is the concern. And opponents of that approach say this is going to be a race to the bottom, and surely every company in America is going to move to New Hampshire. But, of course, in reality, that's probably not what would happen. There's a lot of factors that go into someone deciding where to locate their business. They need the right people to work for them. They need other tax climates to be appealing to them. So I don't think that we'd really have a mass migration to our four non-sales tax states. But that is the concern, because the people who are pushing these new laws are interested in, A, making it hard for small companies, if they're big companies, or they're the states themselves who are looking for revenue and have no interest in being forced to compete for people's tax revenue. They would much rather adopt a destination plan where they can go ahead and just burden other states' businesses with their collection.
So crony corporatists and revenue-hungry politicians aside, what does public opinion polling tell us about the general desirability of an internet sales tax?
The polling in general seems to indicate that the more people understand these attempts, the more they dislike them. So the latest polls are at a 57% opposition across the board to these destination plans. And then with younger voters, so 18 to 29-year-olds, that jumps to a 73% opposition to them, which I think there's something in that says this really isn't the direction we want to go with the internet and what it could be and could do in the future. But I think the challenge with all the polling numbers is, despite how fascinating our conversation is, I don't think that people find it particularly easy to understand or always compelling to learn about. So a lot of this is just educating people about what the facts are and not just sound bites from interested parties.
So tax competition has always kept states from getting too rapacious in their tax collecting, for fear that businesses will move out. How would an internet sales tax that does it on a destination basis change the dynamics of tax competition?
It would be such a reduction for that online. Now what you have is that there's no exit for people. They have to wear their state's sales tax regime sort of like an albatross around their neck, even when they're shopping online. So right now I can go online and I can make a decision about whether I want it to get to me faster, so I'm going to buy something in state, or I really want to avoid that big sales tax, or they're offering shipping free. You have all these choices. And with this legislation, one of those choices would be removed. That, of course, will result in more money being put into tax coffers and less out of your private pocket. If that weren't the bottom line, these states wouldn't be interested in doing it. So they like to say this isn't a new tax, and in some sense that's true, but it is certainly a new reality for the way people will shop online.
So, Jessica, what legislation is currently pending in Congress that addresses internet sales?
Well, there is the hilariously named Marketplace Fairness Act, which is of the destination-based ilk we were discussing. It's been rolling around for a long time, and it did pass the Senate, but stalled in the House a few years back. And its sponsor is Senator Enzi from Wyoming, and it embodies sort of all of the problems we've been speaking about. Just a huge burden on business, a very small exemption just for companies under $1 million in gross sales, which is not much these days. And that's produced sort of I call it MFA 2.0, but it's actually called the Remote Transactions Parity Act. It's been introduced by Chairman Chaffetz, and I think it makes an attempt to fix some of the problems with the MFA, but it unfortunately has brought all its own new problems. And the problem with these is really baked in. It is the destination model. You're never going to get rid of these 10,000 jurisdiction complexities. And if you don't switch and start entertaining the idea of an origin-based approach, you're always going to have these enormous compliance costs for businesses. And there's no real way around that, no matter how you sort of try to exempt these people and that people. And then it just becomes a political mess with people just wanting to find their way out of it and stick it to everyone else.
But when it comes to the lobbyists, it sounds like these 10,000 jurisdictions is a feature, not a bug.
Exactly right. This group of states has been trying for 16 years to harmonize these 10,000 jurisdictions with absolutely no success and no sense of humor, I would also like to add. They issue press releases about the merits of marshmallows and whether they're an ingredient for baked goods, which should not be taxed, or they're a candy. And it all comes down to their ingredients and whether or not they have to be refrigerated and on and on. I've seen papers about when an ice cream cake is ice cream and it should be taxed, or it's a cake and it's a baked good and it's exempt. And no one is laughing because to these people at the local level, this is their revenue and this is their reality. But getting that to match up with asking small businesses online to collect in all of these jurisdictions, constantly changing and distinct from each other, is a bureaucratic nightmare, to say the least. And it's proved a little more politically difficult for these lobbyists, I think, than they expected too. And what we had earlier this year was Chairman Goodlatte on the House side introduced sort of what I call an origin hybrid. It's a nod towards the origin approach, and I think it moves in that direction without being completely that way. It could be improved that way, but it's a step in the right direction, and it shows that people are thinking seriously about this problem, and they're taking the unintended consequences seriously, which is very encouraging.
This sounds like such a mess. Is there any chance that a bill could actually make its way through Congress in a lame duck session to be signed by President Obama, or is a new Congress going to have to pick this up?
It's unclear right now, but the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell did promise proponents of these laws that they would have a vote on this in the Senate before the end of the year. I think that will happen. I don't think he can go back on his word for that. What happens on the House side, I would be surprised if they could get something through by the end of the year. The Senate only has a few more days in session. It's hard to believe, but anything's possible this year in politics. I don't ever want to say never. I have a feeling that we will be having this same debate with our new Congress.
So if the new Congress does pick up the ball on this issue that's been festering for 15 years, I would suspect they could all harvest some nice campaign cash regardless of what side they're on.
Yeah, this is one of those that everyone wants to make money off of. If you're a lobbyist or you're a politician, you want to get some campaign contributions off of. But nobody really wants to go on the record voting on it. We've really benefited from these guys not wanting to vote because they don't want to be seen as voting for a tax increase, which is how people will experience these set of laws. So their number one priority seems to be just avoiding the topic, but they're under such pressure. These big box retailers have an army of lobbyists. And then, of course, there's the state folks who come and demand that they do something about this too.
So, Jessica, why isn't it in Congress's best interest to keep this controversy going forever and just keep milking the lobbyists and donors?
That probably is in their best interest, and that's probably what we've seen, sadly. I wish I had some better news for everyone on the state of American politics, but I think that's what's happening. The states are moving on their own to just unconstitutionally start demanding that companies collect for them who are nowhere in their borders. And those cases are kind of working their way through the courts right now with mixed results back at home. But in order to really get the green light, this is a Commerce Clause issue, and they need federal permission. So they are not going to stop knocking on Congress's door anytime soon. And I think at a certain point, these box stores have spent so much on it that they're really invested in getting some result. And I think most of the politicians would be really happy just to see it go away without having to be on the record voting for or against it in some cases.
Well, as a consumer, Jessica, I hope this dysfunction goes on forever. Thanks so much for coming on the show and bringing us up to date.
It was my pleasure.
That was Jessica Melugin, Adjunct Fellow in Technology Policy at CEI, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. And please check out our podcast archive of nearly 300 interviews. Listen to movers and shakers like Peter Thiel, Steve Forbes, Sal Khan, Grover Norquist, Matt Ridley, Gary Kasparov, Virginia Postrel, Vernon Smith, Kevin Kelly, James Grant, Ralph Nader, David Stockman, and John Mackey. Each week, we bring you interviews with many accomplished thinkers and doers from locations as diverse as Vienna, Budapest, Dubai, Guatemala, London, Lebanon, and all across the U.S. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Donors Trust, the donor-advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit donorstrust.org. Ahead, Trevor Burrus from the Cato Institute takes us on a tour of the campaign finance sausage factory and explains why liberals should favor the defunding of NPR. Stay tuned.